Hi there, my name is Varshini and I'm here to talk to you today about this book I read recently called The Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. If you're at all familiar with the scholarly fields of post-colonial studies and critical theory, then you've definitely heard of Fanon before. He is an incredibly influential writer and one of the most notable authors in the field. I first heard about his books when I was in undergrad. I had some readings from him and I kind of have like a casual interest in writing about colonialism. So the reason I picked this book up is because I was really interested in Fanon's perspective, because he's actually, in addition to a revolutionary, an intellectual, and a writer, he's actually a doctor. He trained as a psychiatrist in France. So Fanon was from Martinique, which was an island colony of France. He was born in 1925 and then moved to France to get his medical degree. And after that, he actually moved to Algeria to fight for the Algerian liberation movement. Algeria at that time was colonized by France. So he served as a wartime doctor, a psychiatrist for some of the revolutionaries and refugees there. So Fanon is so interesting because he brings this perspective of kind of psychoanalysis to the situation. This book in particular, Wretched of the Earth, really analyzes in depth kind of the effects of colonialism on the psychological development of both the colonized and the colonizer. And he analyzes the role of how violence and culture and community organization can further or hinder the fight for national liberation. So the reason I picked this book up recently is because I've had a lot of time in quarantine and finally got to reading this long book. And I've been thinking a lot about kind of the struggles we face here in America. And although Fanon wrote this book in 1961, so like 60 years ago, a lot of what he writes is so applicable even to current day, because everywhere in the world somebody's going through a struggle for liberation. And right here in America, there's nothing more timely than that, with the Black Lives Matter movement that's been kind of a pressing issue for years now, as well as the coronavirus pandemic, and seeing how inequality of outcome kind of persists because of inequalities in race and class and gender and age. So Fanon really has such a unique way of understanding and interpreting these forces around us and how they influence our behavior. So in this video, I'm not going to do like a super critical analysis, because there's a lot of people much smarter than me on the internet who've already done that. But I do want to kind of give a summary of interesting points that I've pulled out as someone kind of broadly interested in medicine, in social justice, and critical theory. So yeah, hope you enjoy. So the first chapter of Fanon's book is titled On Violence, and in this chapter he introduces a very important idea that he uses to build his theories, and it's called dehumanization. So what he means by dehumanization is that the colonial forces would routinely use violence to subjugate the natives already in the land. And through this use of violence, which wasn't necessarily just physical violence, this included kind of the violation and exploitation of individual rights, of communal rights, property rights, things like that, like being kicked off your land and having to take a job for meager pay, or being forced to leave your religion, or being forced to change your language. All of this led to the dehumanization of the colonial natives. So the concept of dehumanization is not necessarily novel as presented in Fanon's book. We're kind of already familiar with this idea when we talk about things like slavery. For example, in America, the owners of enslaved peoples would not treat them as actual people. They weren't humans, they were property to be bought and sold. And in America back then, these rights to hold individual as property were written into the law. But what Fanon shows is that in the colonial setting, the colonizers didn't even need to go that far. Violence allowed them to control the way that the colonized natives acted and believed and thought. So according to Fanon, who uses this kind of like psychoanalytic approach that I was talking about before, the violence of the colonizer turns the native into something that's effectively an animal, because you don't have those native faculties at use anymore. You're not allowed to think and act and behave as you normally would be. So you're just relegated to kind of just existing and surviving, just depending on those survival instincts to keep you alive in a society where you're pretty much barred from exercising your own free will in any way. So the way he writes about it is really interesting, and I'll read a few quotes. He says, "The colonized subject is constantly on his guard. The colonized subject is always presumed guilty. He is dominated but not domesticated. He is made to feel inferior, but is by no means convinced of his inferiority. He patiently waits for the colonist to let his guard down and then jumps on him. The muscles of the colonized are always tensed." And overall, this loss of freedom is just so devastating to your psyche and to your personhood, and you're turned into an animal who just acts on rage and impulse. And while reading this, you may think, like, where does the individual agency of these people go? Fanon writes about them like they're pieces on a chessboard, and which is true. Like, I think some of that does get lost in theory, and it's something that happens a lot when you're reading books like this. But it's also interesting to think about Fanon's ideas, especially when you extend them to the side of the colonizer themselves. One thing he writes is that in this colonial system, the colonizer also in turn loses their humanity, because at the end of the day, they're literally just a tool to carry out the will of the colonial regime. They are just a tool for violence. They don't have the capacity to think and doubt and fight against their orders, or perhaps they even enjoy or feel apathetic about carrying out this violence. So at that point, like, that's the whole point. Like, you lose your empathy and you lose your humanity, and you're a whip, you're a tool, you're a knife. There's nothing more to you than that, than just a means to an end. So both the colonizer and the colonized are kind of in this two-way street of dehumanization. It's just mutual destruction for both parties, and Fanon really shows through this, like, almost psychoanalytic approach how destructive a colonial system can be for everybody involved. So although that Fanon is incredibly critical of the role that violence plays in the colonial establishment, he also maintains that violence is the only way that the colonized natives can regain their humanity. What he says is that by engaging in acts of violence against the oppressor, you're basically reclaiming your own self-will. You're executing an action of your own will instead of doing something because you're forced to or because it's the only thing that you can do. Engaging in violence allows you to build self-confidence, and it builds the path for liberation. And to Fanon, the only way that the nation can be liberated is through the use of violence. So to switch gears kind of into the next part of the book, you can definitely see that Fanon had a huge influence by Marxist thought and philosophy when writing this book. Although Fanon broadly advocates for societies to adopt a socialistic economic and political system, he uses Marxist thought to kind of organize the ways that society is divided and how he builds his theory. So in this book, he divides the native society into three broad classes. So at the top, we have kind of the bourgeoisie, which he calls the colonized intellectual. So these people are the wealthiest of society. They are often intellectuals or capitalists. They're often very well educated, sometimes even in Europe. And so these are the people that hold most of the money and the power in the society. So then we have the native class, which is kind of the working class or the middle class, which is generally in Marxist thought referred to as the proletariat. And then after this, Fanon also talks about another class called the lumpen proletariat. So it's a little vague what exactly this means, but generally it's thought of as kind of an underclass, a group of people that aren't really involved in social or political or civic life. They are just kind of the bottom of the barrel and don't have class consciousness, as Marx would say. So generally in Marxist theory, the lumpen proletariat are not as active in revolution or liberation as perhaps the proletariat class might be. So in contrast to like traditional Marxist theory, Fanon believes that we should actually use the lumpen proletariat and not just leave them ignored. Their efforts could be used to further the cause for national liberation instead of just leaving them kind of relegated off to the sidelines. So I think one of the most interesting parts of Fanon's discussion about these three classes is the emphasis that he places on the colonized elite class. So they're, like I mentioned, they're the bourgeoisie, they're the wealthiest of the society. They have all the power, the money, and the resources. And Fanon is super critical of this class because to him, there's no reason for these people to like really want to topple the colonial regime, because this is the system that's keeping the money and the power in their hands. So for Fanon, the colonized elite are kind of no better than the colonizers themselves. And ironically, the worst part is that these are the people that are in charge of the political movements for national liberation. So because they have that money and power, they're the ones sitting at the top of the throne, organizing revolts or rebellion or whatever. And Fanon feels like this sort of revolution is disingenuous. He believes that revolution should come from the ground up, because when the bourgeoisie are in charge of revolution, they're not going to really change the status quo. They're not going to change the system to really benefit the lowest of the low. They're just going to keep things as is and just exchange a colonizer for a colonized elite at the top of the throne. So to Fanon, revolution must be in the hands of the lumpen proletariat and the proletariat, because without their voices being heard, there's no room for systematic change. And I think what's really valuable about Fanon's analysis is that he extends past this traditional class analysis that Marx typically uses. Because in Fanon's world, you have both the class system, but you also have this introduction of a foreign power. So you have the tension between a wealthy colonial foreign establishment coming into maybe a poorer country. One of the major tools that colonizers use to gain power is to create artificial divisions or strife between native peoples. So what they do is perpetuate war or clashes between neighboring tribes, clans, brothers, things like that. And by getting people to fight against each other, they're distracted from the bigger goal of fighting against the colonizer, which I think is a theme that we can see everywhere you look, even in contemporary society today in America. So the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch upon in this discussion is Fanon's role as a medical doctor. As I mentioned before, he served as a psychiatrist in the Algerian liberation movement. And while serving as a doctor, he saw patients that had suffered intense interrogation or torture at the hands of the colonizer military police. So actually, in the end of this book, he actually presents case studies of people that had come to his office. And what Fanon notes is that the violence that these people suffered manifested as illness, as disease in many different ways. So many of the patients that he saw ended up with anxiety disorders, depression, schizophrenia, violent tendencies. There were also psychosomatic symptoms like headaches, tachycardia, muscle tremors, things like that. And you can see how the cases that he saw influenced the way that he develops his theory, because he talks a lot about how the colonized is always under duress and is always in a state of constant muscular tonus. So he derives some of those ideas from the empirical evidence that he views firsthand as a doctor serving in the war front. Outside of acquiring direct bodily harm between person to person or cases like PTSD, it might be hard to see how living under an oppressive kind of environment such as colonialism can actually fester in your mind and kind of create these mental and physical health defects. And hearing Fanon talk about it in his book kind of reminds me of this idea of allostatic load and adverse childhood events, also called ACEs, both also kind of go at this idea of how continual chronic stress from racism or from oppression or from colonialism itself as an overarching kind of environment can actually influence the physical or mental health of an individual. For people who have to navigate living in a racist world, kind of contending through the micro and macro aggressions of everyday life can actually weigh down on you and create tangible health defects like heightened blood pressure or increased propensity for diabetes or insomnia. There's so much evidence for how these overarching structures of injustice can actually cause inequalities in health outcomes. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd really recommend looking up allostatic load. Fanon ends his book talking about the struggle for national liberation and makes it very clear that when establishing your own nation, you should never be trying to catch up or beat or surpass Europe. The idea is to pave your own path and not be influenced by European metrics of success. The new nation needs to be able to carve out its own trajectory and its own role and position in the international sphere, because when you allow yourself to be measured by someone else's scale, you'll always fall short. And Fanon warns us, not to allow ourselves to be continually disrespected in this way. I would really recommend this book to anybody who's really interested in social justice or liberation, especially if you've read a lot of popular nonfiction these days and kind of want to delve into something deeper. If you're interested in learning more about Wretched of the Earth, I would really recommend that you check out another YouTube review that I've linked in the description box down below by Onyx Isis. She provides a voice from the Black community and really offers a nuanced perspective to the timelessness of Fanon's lesson. He also wrote another book about racism specifically, this was about colonialism, called Black Skin, White Masks, and I hope to read that one soon and come back to you guys maybe with another video. Thank you so much for listening, and leave me a comment if you have anything to say. Thanks!